Well, good morning again, everyone. It is good to be here with you. I have a special guest with me today, Millie Netlin and her daughter Robin. Millie's my next door neighbor. I mow her yard. I clear her snow, and she lets my dog play in the backyard, and it's a beautiful relationship. Let's welcome Millie. And I buried her husband. And we have become very good friends over the years, as I have with so many of my parishioners, and as is happening with you folks as well. So in my next parish, when you come and visit me, you'll get the same treatment, okay? So I have a story for you today. It comes from a long time ago when I was a kid, and it's Saturday mornings, and Saturday with my dad. Dad worked 5 days a week. He was a hard worker. He worked for the Power and Light Company. If any of you remember Iowa Public Service, he worked in the office there. He transferred stock. So if you had Iowa Public Service stock, you talked to my dad at one time, because he was the only guy in the company that did that. And so, but Saturdays would roll around, and my mom worked on Saturday mornings, and so we would drop her off down at the clothing store where she worked. And then we would run over to the west side of Sioux City, pick up my uncle. His name was Al, actually his dad's uncle, my great uncle. We'd pick up Al, and we would head down to the Sunshine grocery store down on Gordon Drive, where we would go in, and the first thing that you see when you walk into Sunshine, or walked into Sunshine, it's now a furniture store, was a coffee bar, a coffee counter, and a donut machine. Very first thing was the donut machine. And so it was one of those old-fashioned donuts machines where the worker would put the dough up in this little container, and the container would rock back and forth like this and plop perfect donuts down into the grease. And then they would take this little ride across the grease pan, and when they got to the end of the ride, they came up this little ramp, and then they flipped over into another grease. Have you any of you ever seen this? Flipped over into another grease pan where they fried the other side of the donuts, and then up a ramp onto a place where they would dry, and then they would put chocolate on them, or white frosting, or maple. Oh, it was so good. Maple with nuts. No salt on the nuts. You mess it up if there's salt on the nuts. And we would go and sit at the counter. We'd watch this for a little while because, I'm 6, 7 years old. This is interesting. And we would sit at the counter for a better part of an hour, and Dad and Al would have coffee. Sometimes Uncle Mart would join them. And we had donuts. And to this day, I remember everything about it, every little detail. I remember the smell of the grease when you walked in. I remember the sweat on the brow of the waitress who served us, and she wore one of these little white dresses that you wear at coffee counters, and she had a pencil behind her ear and a pad that she would take orders, and I can still feel the texture of the countertops and the stools that would rock back and forth. I can remember every detail. It's such powerful stuff. So much so that when I've had my own grandkids, I wanted them to have the same kinds of things. And it started in Fort Dodge with Marie, and then later Tess, and now we're up here with Greta and soon to be Jack, and down there, because there is no such thing as a donut shop or a coffee bar down there, we started doing pancakes. And then up here we do Happy Meals because that's what works for the time of day. I wish we could take them to Bob's, because I will tell you, and it pains me to say it, Bob's donuts are as good as Sunshine donuts. It's hard to say. You hear that, Bob? And I will tell you that no one, Bob, makes those little puff things, those little donut holes, like he does. Those are air sugar. They are wonderful. So the first time I did this with Marie, I got firm instructions from my daughter, her mom: no syrup. She gets too much sugar. And so we went and we got the kiddie menu, and there were kiddie pancakes. And I said, let's do it. But no syrup. And so I took this picture. Would you show them? There we go. She posted it on Facebook with the caption, "That's why you can't let granddaughters go with grandfathers." But you know, I did this because I wanted them to have the same kind of powerful memories. And I know they will. They will remember things in the exact same kind of detail that I remember coffee on Saturday mornings with Dad and Al. Something happens when we get together around food. Something very powerful happens. It's when we are over food, when we are sharing a meal, things happen that are life-forming, that are identity-providing. And to prove this, all I would have to do is just ask you to recount your childhood memory of Christmas dinner. And if you were to go ahead and do that, the sermon by now would be over for you, because you would do exactly the same thing I did. You would be able to remember in detail everything that happened. You would remember when you got to dinner. You would remember not only what you ate, but who prepared it, how it was prepared, your part in the preparation, and the kind of relationship you had with your mom or your grandma or your grandpa or whoever it was that prepared that meal, and it was bound around the preparation of that food. You remember who was there. You remember the exact order in which things happened. I know for me, I could tell you exactly on the table where the lefse was, where the krumkake was, where the flatbread was. I could tell you where everything was. It was laid out in perfect order every time the same way. And you could do the same thing. It's powerful stuff. We gather around food, and it's not just a meal. It's life-giving. It provides us with an identity. When we remember those things in our lives, we remember who we are. We remember why we're here. Let's sing. Well, I wanted to lay that out for you today to start with, because this is exactly where we're going with today's lesson. It's Exodus chapter 12. Pam just read it. It's the story of the Passover. And, you know, just like Sunshine Donuts, and just like pancakes and Happy Meals, and just like your memories of Christmas dinner, this meal, for those who participate in it, is life-forming and identity-giving. It tells the people who participate in this meal who they are. It reminds them who they are. It connects them with who they are. And this is important because if you remember from the sermon last week, these people are suffering from an identity crisis. They are slaves. They are called two things in the book of Exodus by everyone except God. God calls them his children. He thinks of them as his children. He sees them as his children. But everybody else thinks of them as Hebrews or slaves. Even they think of themselves as Hebrews and slaves. And by the way, the word Hebrew, it's a word that means from the other side of the river. In other words, they are a people without a home. And this is who they are. And they belong to someone by the name of Pharaoh. And this man, Pharaoh, believes that he is God, and the rest of the world is going along with that same fiction, that he is a God. He believes that he is the morning sun that rises in the east. He believes that he is the stars that appear in the nighttime. In other words, no morning comes without the Pharaoh, and no evening comes without the Pharaoh. He is in charge of everything. The world literally revolves around him, which of course is not true. But if you begin to buy into this stuff, as the Pharaoh did, as the rest of the world did, as the Israelites did, the Hebrew slaves, it gets dark in a hurry. It's the kind of darkness that has the Pharaoh ordering his soldiers to throw Hebrew baby boys into the Nile River so that the world will continue to revolve around him. It's the kind of fiction that enslaves an entire people for 430 years, because if the world revolves around you, you have to maintain control. And the way to do that is to put people who threaten you into slavery. And by the way, let me just stop here. I'm wondering, is there anything that enslaves you? Is there anything that pretends to be, like so much of the world, pretends to be the morning sun that rises in the east and the stars that appear in the evening? I mean, it's all over the place. Things around which the world revolves. What about the acquisition of wealth? What about the position that you obtain in your job or in your community, a place of influence? By the way, did you know that there is now a profession in the world called influencer? People who go on social media to try to influence others. So they go to Bali and they take a bunch of pictures in Bali of them on the beach and them doing this, them eating that, and then you're supposed to see that and say, "Oh, wow, maybe I should do that too." And then they go someplace else, they do something else, they take pictures of themselves, and they try to influence people. And you know, you can't have a profession without people buying into it. People all over the world are buying into this stuff. It is what it is. And you know, some of these things are great, by the way. Acquisition of wealth, there's nothing wrong with that. Having a position of influence in the community, making a name for yourself, those are all great things, except as they become the most important thing in our lives. And we have talked about this many times, but I'm going to talk about it again and again and again. Because when we make those things the most important things in our lives, they become gods to us. And we know that they're not. But if we start buying into the fiction, pretty soon, the way they impress their identity upon us has a way of enslaving us. I mean, for those who acquire wealth, then it becomes their God. When is enough? For those who have a position of influence, and that's their God, where does it stop? When do you get a break from being out there and cultivating that image? And on it goes. And so we have Exodus chapter 12. And God says to Moses, "I'm going to free the slaves, and it's going to happen through a meal." And I want you to notice, again, just like Sunshine Donuts and pancakes and Happy Meals and Christmas Eve, I want you to notice the details of chapter 12. Take a lamb, a spotless lamb, and sacrifice it. Don't boil it, don't eat it raw, roast it. Serve it with bitter herbs. Take the blood, use a hyssop branch. Small details, right? Odd details. And dip the branch in the blood and paint the blood over the doorpost. Eat standing up with hats on and walking sticks in hand. And when this happens, on that night, I will come into Egypt, and I will go into the houses where there is no blood over the doorposts, God says, and I will kill the firstborn. But for those of you who have the blood on the doorpost, you will be spared, and you will be set free by this action. And that's what happens. And as it unfolds, the lies of the gods of this world are exposed for what they are. The powers that hold them in slavery are broken, and God's people are set free. And it happens in the power of a meal, as they sit down together, as they eat together. And God is present, and he brings his salvation through it. Let's sing. So in a few minutes, you're going to come up to this altar rail, and you're going to receive a little wafer like this, pressed wafer, and half a sip of wine. And it doesn't look like much. As I think I've said in other places, it's probably the smallest meal you'll eat all week. But don't be mistaken. It is the power of God, given and shed for you. And I want you to notice, it's no mistake, that the first time this happened, Jesus and his disciples were celebrating the Passover. Notice the details. There is bread, unleavened. There is wine, body and blood. There is no lamb at this meal that's recorded, but the lamb is there in the middle, Jesus himself, who will be sacrificed. He will die on the cross for their sins. And there will be blood. And his blood will be painted over the doorpost of our lives, so that we will know that in this meal, as we eat and drink, full and free forgiveness of everything and anything that assails you is yours. You have been set free. And I know some of you have carried things for years, for decades, trials and troubles and things that you cannot shake. I know that there are people in your lives with whom you disagree and do not get along with, people in some cases that you've not spoken to in years, people who are gone and you're mourning their loss, like I do with Uncle Al. And all of that is brought together in this meal, because you see, it's not just us up here doing this thing. It's not just First Lutheran. This is the power of God in our lives, and it transcends time and space, so that when we are eating here, we are at the table with Jesus in the upper room on the night in which he was betrayed, celebrating the second Passover. And everyone is there. Even if they're not here today, they are there with you now. There's a movie, and I have the clip, but I'm not going to show it. There's not enough time. But there's a movie called Places in the Heart, 1984. I don't know if you've ever seen it. The final scene is absolutely amazing because they're passing communion around. And all the people who have hurt each other are taking this communion. They're sitting right next to each other, and they're passing communion to each other. And then you get, and I remember watching this for the first time, Jill and I watched it together, and it's an all-white church because this is the deep south, and there is segregation like you can't believe. And as it's going around, I whispered to Jill, too bad the black guy couldn't be there. The guy who was beat up by the Ku Klux Klan members who were in the church that day. And, of course, pass it around, and who's there? The black man who gets beat up. And it gets passed further and further down. And then the last two who receive it. The woman who's the main character of the story, her husband, who was shot at the beginning of the movie. And the man who shot him, who was lynched at the beginning of the movie. So powerful. And it's exactly what happens right here with us every time we eat and drink. We are all together. We are all here. Every one of us. Whether it's here in Fort Dodge or down in Des Moines or halfway around the world in a church that's being persecuted because they live in a place where Christianity is banned. And it's happening here and now, whether it's here or 10 years from now or 50 years from now or 2,000 years from now. Or 3,500 years from now when the first Passover took place. We are all together. That's how large and powerful our God is. And if he can do that, what does he do with the sin that you bring to this table? It's just a little wafer. It's just a half a sip of wine. But it is the power of God in your lives. And I will tell you that when it comes to all those other gods I mentioned earlier, they don't hold a candle to that. They can't possibly give you the kind of life that this gives you. This is the most important hour of your week. Because here you find the freedom to go out there and live your life the way God wants you to live your life. Full and free. With the promise of an eternity. With those that you love. And those who have wounded you, and those whom you have wounded. It's all washed away, taken away by the blood of the Lamb. So come, eat, drink, and know the power of this meal to give you life and make you who you are, who God intended you to be. Amen.